Porra nenhuma. Olha tremendo lá os pés dele lá.
The person you are seeing on your screen right now is Jerson D. Melo Machado, a 19-year-old from Brazil. His story is, well, to say the least, quite sad and depressing. And just like his story, his fate was also sad and depressing as well. But to fully understand his story, we will have to start from the beginning. Jerson's start to life, unfortunately, wasn't the most ideal. He was born into extreme poverty in Brazil with his 4 siblings. It was so extreme that the conditions were determined so unstable that child welfare services had to intervene. All of his 4 siblings and him were put up for adoption. Fortunately for his siblings, they were adopted pretty fast into stable homes. But unfortunately for Jerson, he would not be adopted. If I had to guess the reason, it was because of early behavioral issues, signs of mental health illness, and emotional instability. So basically for all of his childhood, he would be in shelters and state institutions. Over this time, he would latch onto fantasies, specifically ones about lions, and him being special. We know this because he told his counselor that. Now, his counselor was really the only person he could call family, as she was really the only one that seemed to truly care about him. But he had always loved animals, but as his mental state weakened, that love turned into obsession. He started talking more and more about lions, about how he believed he had a connection with them, and how he wanted to go to Africa, how he wanted to become a lion tamer. And he didn't say these things like dreams or metaphors, he said them like facts, like goals, like destiny. Several people who knew him said he attempted before to flee his home area, trying to reach airports or distant towns, because he believed he could somehow make it to Africa where his lions were waiting for him. Now, these are clear signs of schizophrenia. The counselor, who had followed him for years, said she repeatedly warned the system that he needed psychiatric care, that he was vulnerable, that he was slipping farther and farther away from reality. But resources were limited and cases like his were actually very common. And in places with underfunded social systems, people like Jerson are often overlooked because no one cares. And there's also too many people like him and few people trying to help. By the age of 18, Jerson would have been released from these institutions. It was stated that he was living on the streets at times, drifting and spending his time wandering João Pessoa. During this time, he visited the Arruda Camara Zoo more and more, which had lions in it. Every time he went, he would just look at the lions, until on November 30th, 2025, he wouldn't just look at them, he would jump into their enclosure. Jerson didn't sneak through a gate or slip past a barrier. He climbed a tree that was growing right alongside the outer wall of the lion enclosure. Now that wall was around 20 feet tall, far too high for anyone to jump, but the tree's branches stretched close enough that he could use them like a ladder. Witnesses said he was making his way up the trunk, steady and calm, as if he genuinely believed he belonged on the other side. Once he reached the higher branches, he shifted his weight over the enclosure wall and began lowering himself down, using the tree limbs for support, as you can see in the footage caught by one of the bystanders. Some visitors shouted for him to climb back up, others froze, and a few began running to find zoo staff. But Jerson didn't react to any of them. He just stood there calmly, almost peacefully, like he thought the lioness was going to welcome him. The lioness, though, did not see him as a friend. She saw something completely unnatural inside her territory, something that triggered every instinct she had been born with. You can see in the video he starts to slide down the tree, still looking at the lioness. And that's when the animal jumped at him and started to clamp down on his body, shaking him with that terrifying, controlled violence that only a powerful predator has. His body jerked under her weight, his legs kicking up, not out of resistance but out of the body's involuntary response to overwhelming trauma. Zoo workers rushed toward the enclosure, yelling and throwing objects, trying anything to distract her. But once a lion begins an attack like that, stopping it is almost impossible. The lioness dragged him a few feet across the dirt, pulling him deeper into the enclosure as he went limp beneath her. The movements she made weren't chaotic. They were disturbingly methodical, the way big cats naturally disable their prey. His clothing was torn, dust arose around them from the struggle, and every attempt by zoo staff to intervene only made the lioness more defensive, more protective of what she now viewed as her prey. Emergency alarms were triggered and staff scrambled to get tranquilizers, but these tranquilizers would take time, minutes, and Jerson didn't have any minutes. One worker tried banging on the enclosure bars to startle her, but she barely reacted, keeping her jaws locked and her body pressed firmly onto him. For the people watching, the helplessness was unbearable. You can't climb in, and you can't pull a line off someone. You can't shoot the line without risking the other person, and you can't negotiate with an apex predator acting purely on instinct. By the time the tranquilizer gun finally arrived, the damage was already catastrophic. The lioness was hit once, then twice, and eventually her grip weakened as the sedative took hold. But by then, witnesses said his body wasn't moving. Rescue teams entered once she collapsed, pulling him away as gently as they could, but the state he was in made it clear that nothing could have saved him even if help had reached him instantly. Fortunately for the lioness, it lived, but for Jerson, he didn't. What's really sad about this situation was the only person to actually publicly mourn him was the counselor, saying, "My feeling is one of total powerlessness, and this feeling causes enormous pain in my soul." A small artificial pond behind an apartment complex in Cook County, Illinois, sat still and quiet in 2012. The purpose of these ponds are to manage stormwater for the entire apartment complex. When it rains, the water flows off of roofs, parking lots, sidewalks, and streets. Since you don't want the water to pool and flood certain areas of the town or city, all the rainwater goes to these artificial ponds. Now, this wouldn't be a problem, but these ponds bring in dangers of their own. Wildlife. Now, depending on where you live, you got all sorts. Here in the United States, where I live, you got alligators, snakes, and if you live in Florida, crocodiles, which are all obviously harmful. Since you don't want these animals living near where people live, homeowners or apartment complex owners call pest control companies to remove these animals away out of these ponds and usually into other more suitable habitats. Usually. Now, these companies also have another purpose, which is to provide property maintenance services. To give some examples, they check outdoor areas, inspect animal activity, monitor wildlife problems, handle nuisance animals, or just general grounds maintenance tasks. Now, the apartment complex owner in Cook County had some trouble with some Canadian geese, as they produce an enormous amounts of droppings, which is about 2 to 4 pounds a day, which is way more than I thought. They also destroy landscaping and are also super aggressive. They just cause a whole bunch of problems. So the apartment complex owner decided to bring in some mute swans to chase away the Canadian geese. Now, from the 1900s to the 2010s, it was normal to do this, which doesn't really make any sense, but I'll reveal why a bit later. So, on April 14th, 2012, the apartment complex owner called Northwest Exterminating to handle outdoor maintenance. And part of the job included checking on the swans that the complex had introduced to control Canadian geese. The company would only send out one employee who was named Anthony Hensley, who was 37 years old. Now, Anthony was very qualified for this job. He had experience in checking ponds, dealing with wildlife activity, and handling these kinds of assignments. So to do this job, he would have to inspect and monitor the swans. So he would have to go in the pond as the swans stayed near the center of it. Because there was no other way to reach the swans or check whatever the apartment complex wanted to check, it would make it hard to see them, as the retention pond didn't have a walkway, it didn't have a dock, and you couldn't stand along the shore and see everything properly. So the only real way to get close enough was by getting into a kayak and paddling out there. So Anthony pushed the kayak into the water and started to paddle out near the center. As he moved closer to the swans, one of them lifted its head and locked onto him. Now, mute swans are extremely territorial, especially during nesting season, and this particular swan had a nest somewhere on the pond, which Anthony didn't know about as he wasn't told about it. So the second it felt like Anthony was getting too close, it started swimming toward him. At first, it moved slow, like it was just watching him, but then it began speeding up. These birds don't really give warnings, they just go straight into aggression. Before Anthony even had any time to react, the swan charged straight at the kayak and rammed into the side of it with basically its full body weight, Kayaks are extremely easy to flip when hit from the side, and that one hit was enough to flip the whole thing over instantly, sending Anthony straight into the freezing cold water. Now Anthony would resurface and try to grab the overturned kayak, but the swan wasn't done. It was already attacking again. It slammed its wings into the water and onto him, forcing him underwater every time he tried to lift himself up. He came up gasping for air and trying to hold on to the kayak, but the swan rammed him again and knocked his hands away. Every attempt he made to breathe was cut off, because the swan either A, struck him with its wings, or B, splashed water straight into his face. Now the cold water made everything a whole lot worse for him, because freezing water tightens and makes your muscles freeze. It also drains your strength faster, so every second that passed made it harder for him to fight both the water and the swan. People on the shore eventually saw the splashing and realized something was wrong. Someone shouted and another person ran along the bank trying to see what was going on. One person even jumped into the pond to try to help, but the water was so cold that it slowed them down right away, and the pond was just too deep in the middle for them to reach him in time. Meanwhile, Anthony was struggling just to keep his head above the surface. Every time he lifted himself even a little, the swan came at him again and forced him back down. His arms were weakening, his legs were tightening from the cold, and he couldn't get enough strength to stay up. He tried one last time to lift himself above the surface, but again he slipped under, and this time he didn't come back up. The pond, which had been thrashing with movement moments later, suddenly started to go still except for the swan circling the overturned kayak. The person who tried to swim out kept diving under the water trying to find him. But retention ponds have extremely murky bottoms, and the second you disturb the sediment, everything turns pitch black underwater, so they couldn't see anything at all. Emergency responders would arrive and go into the water to help with the search. After multiple dives, they finally found Anthony underwater and brought him to shore. They tried CPR, honestly they tried everything they could, but the cold water, being forced underwater repeatedly, and drowning all combined so fast that nothing could be reversed. Anthony Hensley died that morning in the retention pond behind the apartment complex. So going back to what I said earlier, adding the mute swans literally made no sense. They are basically the geese just on steroids. To put it in perspective, a mute swan is on average 25 to 35 pounds, with a 5 to 6 wingspan with very thick and heavy bodies. They are so powerful that their wing beats can fracture bones. Now compare this to the Canadian geese, which is a mere 7 to 14 pounds on average, with a significantly shorter wingspan at 4 to 5 feet. So think about that logically. In trying to get rid of a moderate threat, the apartment complex owners replaced it with a far more dangerous one. That's like if a farmer is trying to get rid of some coyotes and then they bring in a grizzly bear to chase them off. The geese were annoying and aggressive, sure, but they weren't going to overpower a grown man or pull someone under the water. The swans they brought in were bigger, stronger, way more territorial, and actually capable of doing real physical harm. Now, to be fair, in their defense, they probably didn't think they were capable of killing a fully grown man with experience. But even still, it was a stupid decision, as they are still overall more of a menace than the geese. Now, another thing to note is Anthony didn't have any protective gear on, because he thought he didn't need it, because I guess no one told him that the swans were aggressive. I mean, if everyone treats the swans like harmless decorations, then he naturally assumed the same, right? But after the incident, Anthony Hensley's family was obviously devastated, and his wife ended up filing a wrongful death lawsuit. She sued the apartment complex owners, the property managed company, the owners association, and basically anyone who had a role in putting those mute swans on the pond, or in sending Anthony out there without any kind of protective gear or warning. Her argument was simple. The apartment complex brought in the swans on purpose to chase the geese away. They knew, or should have known, that mute swans are extremely territorial and aggressive, and they failed to warn Anthony or take any steps to make sure the area was actually safe for workers. The lawsuit pointed out that mute swans aren't harmless. and that a lot of people don't realize how strong or dangerous they can be, and that the complex had a responsibility to understand the risks of the wildlife they introduced. She also argued that the pond had no real safety measures, no barriers, no signage, nothing to protect someone who had to get close to the swans as part of their job. Anthony really wasn't doing anything wrong. He was sent there as a part of a normal maintenance, and the lawsuit basically said he was put into a dangerous situation without being told the real threat he was walking into. Now, the case didn't go to trial, it ended in a settlement, which means the parties agreed on something privately. The amount wasn't made public, which is normal for wrongful death settlements. But the important thing is that the lawsuit recognized that what happened to Anthony wasn't just some random accident. It was a result of choices made by the property owners when they introduced a more dangerous animal to fix a smaller problem. And Anthony ended up paying the price for it while he was just doing his job. Also, the swans were not removed or killed after the accident. They remained on the property because their behavior was technically considered natural territorial aggression, not an abnormal attack. But eventually they were phased out, meaning some years later they were removed.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.